Hey there, this is Rocky from BusinessWritingTutorials.com, and today we're going to go over a few guidelines for using commas. First, we should discuss when not to use commas. It's commonly taught that a comma equals a pause, with the idea that you would insert a comma in your written word in places where you would naturally pause when speaking. This is unfortunately a myth. It's a rough guideline that works many times, but in many other cases it will lead you to incorrect punctuation, which can actually affect the meaning of your sentences. For business writing, academic writing, and other formal contexts, we do want to be precise and accurate, so we have to look at some of the guidelines. So that, of course, leads us to the question, when do we use commas? And unfortunately, it's not so easy. As just discussed, it's not a simple guideline of when it's a pause. But the good news is that there are a few basics that we can start with that cover a lot of situations. And I chose a few today that are very common, that I think are more or less easy to grasp, and also have the benefit of, when you get these down, your brain will sort of naturally extend the ideas to some other guidelines without you even knowing it. So getting these down will get you started to have a cleaner, more professional, and more accurate presentation of your documents. So let's jump in. So I'm going to go over 4 common uses of commas today. We'll start out with lists, which are nice and easy. We'll look at sentence introductions. Third, we'll look at extra information in the middle of sentences. And finally, we'll look at a case that's very common in most documents. Let's get started with lists. And by lists, of course, I mean a series of elements like A, B, and C. On its own, this is pretty easy, but we do have to address this one issue of the final comma in the series, which is also called the serial comma. It has a few other names. Many educators, writers, and editors will argue that you can or should omit this final comma in the series in certain cases. Primarily, I think the argument is to improve flow. But the problem is when you take this approach, you always have to stop on a case-by-case basis, look at the sentence, and decide whether leaving out the comma would cause any sort of confusion to your reader. That's more work, and you could be wrong sometimes. So I think the easier way to handle this, and the more precise way, is just to always use the final comma in the series. Let's take a look at an example so you can see what we're talking about here. Alright, so an example sentence: my favorite ice creams are strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate and marshmallow. And if you find yourself scratching your head a little bit when I was reading that last part of the sentence, which I know I read very quickly and in an even tone, the point is that you can't really tell where the final division of ideas comes. So the commas here are chunking the ideas for the readers, and we don't really know if we mean strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate and marshmallow, or if we mean strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate and marshmallow. So this is an example of how leaving out the comma would, at the very least, would cause the reader to stop and have to try to decipher your meaning, but more likely the reader wouldn't even be able to figure it out. So we don't want to do these things to our readers, and we can avoid it by simply always using this serial comma. And there's a few other reasons to use it too. Well, one, like I said, it's easy to remember. Just always include it. And when you do, you're always right. It's more precise. This goes hand in hand, but the idea is that we don't want to ever introduce any ambiguities into our writing if we don't have to. It provides a consistent usage for the reader if we're always including the comma instead of picking and choosing when to do it. So it's a little more professional presentation in my opinion. And you also have most authorities on your side. Most manuals of Guides of American English, for example, the Chicago Manual of Style, APA, MLA, and others, will recommend using the serial comma. There are a couple exceptions. For example, in journalism, they tend to omit the final comma. British English, I've seen, at least from what I've seen, tends to omit it. But again, for our purposes here, we want to always include it. Okay, well, that was our first comma usage. Hopefully that wasn't too bad, so you've got one down. Let's look at our next topic here, sentence introductions. And what are sentence intros? Well, they could be words, phrases, or clauses. And sentence words, single words, could be transition words or sentence adverbs. I don't want to throw out too many of these grammatical terms, but and I will try to explain everything in lay terms as much as possible, but I did want to include the words on the slide so that you can search for more information if you want on your own. Okay, let's take a look at some ideas of what are introductory words to sentences. Okay, one really common example is however. Also, we have similar words such as therefore, hence, which I don't even like to use, so I'm not sure why that came to mind. But transition words add some sort of, they're like signposts for the readers. So you could have transition words of contrast, which is like however. Could also be order of events, order in your document, time, lots of different things. So in this case, however, his presence at the crime scene is suspicious. We just need a comma after this intro word. This is a pretty simple idea, and I think most people get this right. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but if you want to check out online, you can search for transition words and introductory words to sentences. There are a lot of good sites. I just came across this one today. Looks like smartwords.org. First time I've seen this one, but they did a nice job here of organizing the different transitions, similarity, limitation, contradiction, condition, things like that. And they are mixed here between words and phrases, but it will hopefully help extend your vocabulary a little bit, give you some ideas, and again, it's nicely organized. You could search online for other ones as well. Okay, sentence adverbs are a single word, which is an adverb at the beginning of a sentence that modifies the rest of the sentence. We do this very frequently when we're speaking and when we're writing. And again, I think this is something that most people get right, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Most adverbs end in ly, although not all of them. But here is one example. Unfortunately, I can't afford the tickets. The idea is that I can't afford the tickets is an unfortunate situation, so this adverb modifies the whole sentence. That sounds so simple that it's almost kind of silly to say, but basically you just need a comma after these sentence adverbs. Again, you can look for lists of them online. This is one that I pulled up earlier from yourdictionary.com. Again, first time I've seen this, but it's nicely organized. And again, just some ideas to expand your vocabulary, and you can search for others. All right, let's move on to some of the more complex ideas, which are the phrases and clauses. Okay, well, what do I mean by an introductory sentence phrase? Well, it's more than one word, for starters, and I'll explain the difference between the phrase and the clause in the next slide. But for the introductory phrases, there are lots of different types. There's prepositional phrases, adverbial, participial, infinitive, appositive, absolute. You don't have to remember all of these names, or really any of these names, although they might be helpful in remembering things or finding more information, so I included them on the slide. I think probably the easiest way to go about this is to look at a few examples, and then we'll try to find some common threads here. First, we have an example of a prepositional phrase. In the middle of the presentation, comma, the computer turned off. Well, we know it's a prepositional phrase because it starts with a preposition. You can look for lists of those online as well. Again, less important to know that it's called a prepositional phrase, and more important to know that we have a group of words here in the beginning of a sentence that can't stand on its own as a grammatically complete sentence, and provides some context or frames or modifies the rest of the sentence. Just as a side note about these prepositional phrases, you are actually allowed to omit the comma in prepositional phrases that start a sentence that are fewer than 5 words. It's a rough guideline. Some people say 4, some people say 5, some people say never. To avoid confusion, probably a good way to start out with prepositional phrases would be to just always include the comma, because if you do, you're always right. So similar situation, like we saw with the list before, you could take the approach of just always being right. That's to always include the comma after the opening introductory prepositional phrase. Then later in the future, you could decide to pick and choose where you want to do it. For example, one sentence where you might omit the comma would be something like with a year. For example, in 2012, Congress passed such and such policy. You could omit that comma after in 2012 because it's fewer than 5 words. Those are just for the prepositional phrases. For the rest of the phrases, length doesn't really apply. Okay, so here we have an example of an adverbial phrase. If the time is right, comma, pop the question. Also, we could have other ones. Another example would be when the time was right, he pops the question. That would also take a comma. This is an example of a participial phrase. Probably the clue that you would use here is that you'll see an ing word that starts the phrase. And when you see an ing word that starts a phrase and the phrase can't stand on its own, it's probably modifying the rest of the sentence. And that's one of the common threads. Already in our first few examples, we've seen that these phrases can't stand on their own as grammatically complete sentences, and they provide some context or describe the rest of the sentence. So we know that I reached my destination while I was driving by night. Okay, so we need commas after all those. Here we have an infinitive phrase. To explain these comma rules, I need to use several examples. And again, can't stand on its own and frames the rest of the sentence. So, of course, I don't expect anyone to remember all the different names of these opening phrases, and you don't have to. The good news is that you just have to remember some common themes. And the two common themes, which I just mentioned before, are 1, can't stand by itself, and it frames the rest of the sentence. So it doesn't matter if you know if it's a participial or an adverbial phrase. Pretty much these two rules are always going to apply. Now let's take a look at some clauses. Well, first I should probably explain the difference between a phrase and a clause. A phrase is a group of words that doesn't have its own subject-verb pair, and a clause does. And there are different kinds of clauses. There are dependent and independent clauses. That doesn't matter too much either, but basically we're just going to deal with, in most cases it's longer, but not always. These are going to have subject-verb pairs. But it's the same idea as before, so even if you can't remember what the difference is between a phrase and a clause, again, we have a group of words in the beginning of a sentence. It can stand on its own as its own grammatically complete sentence, and it provides the context or frames the rest of the sentence. In this case, we have a condition, but it could be the other sort of situations that we saw before. Another common one is because. So these if clauses and because clauses are very common, and when they're at the beginning of the sentence, they basically always take a comma. I shouldn't say always, because English is full of examples, and I'm probably forgetting something, so I'll say almost always. How about that? Okay. But again, the same kind of patterns that we saw before. Let's move on to our third common usage we're going to look at, and this is extra information in the middle of a sentence. This one's a little bit trickier. Okay, again, we could have a word, phrase, or clause, but this time it's not opening the sentence in the middle. Of course, we want our extra information to be relevant, otherwise what's it doing there? And this is the key word that we're going to see throughout this particular common usage over and over. I'll be referring to this idea of non-essential. When I say non-essential, I mean it's not essential to understanding the core idea of the sentence, meaning we could take this extra information out and still have basically the same fundamental idea. Let's take a look at a quick example where we could take this one-word transition word that we had previously at the beginning of a sentence. Now we see it in the middle of a sentence. The report was, however, outdated. And the idea here is that however is not essential. It interrupts the flow of the sentence. It's extra information. For these reasons, we need to add commas around it. Let's do a quick test and take it out. The report was outdated. We still have the fundamental idea. We haven't lost the idea. We haven't created a grammatically incomplete sentence. So we know this is just some extra info. It's not essential, and we have to put commas around it. Let's look at some more examples. Here's a base sentence just to have something to work with. Michael Corleone learned that Fredo had betrayed him. So we want to add something into the sentence. Now when I say extra information, we could add in a transition. It could be effect, emphasis, clarity, context. There's a lot of reasons we would want to add something into our sentence. In this case, we have a little extra effect. Michael Corleone learned that Fredo, his own brother, had betrayed him. Okay, well, we know that we could take this phrase, his own brother, out and still have the fundamental idea because we just had that base sentence. But just wanted to show you how, working from the other direction, how we could do this. Another example. I'm in favor of Mr. Smith. I wouldn't, therefore, object to him running for the position. Sometimes you'll see this with therefore, however. Sometimes you see an adverb kind of stuck in, and again, the common theme is we're adding something in, a word or a phrase, that's not essential to the main meaning. Can we take this out? I wouldn't object to him running for the position. Yeah, it's the same fundamental meaning. We just added a little transition or effect here. In this case, probably it's more emphasis. And we could do the same thing with a sentence adverb, which, well, this isn't a sentence adverb anymore because it only modifies part of the sentence, but it's the same idea with what we saw with the opening sentence adverbs previously. I wanted to attend the event, but sadly was busy that evening. So this word sadly is basically thrown in for extra effect or context, and it modifies part of the sentence, but can't stand on its own. We can take it out. It's not essential to understanding the main idea. It interrupts the flow of the sentence. For all these reasons, we have to add commas around it. Let's take a couple of examples now to show you why it's so important to use the commas correctly and how the meaning of the sentence can actually change. Here's another base sentence to work with. The bouncer threw the guy out of line. Well, this doesn't tell us a whole lot, but we know there was a bouncer, and he threw a guy out of line. Okay, let's add something. Here we're adding a little bit of context. The bouncer, checking ID, threw the guy out of line. Now we have to decide if we want to include commas around this phrase, checking ID. Well, we have our choice. We can include the commas or not, and they're both correct. However, they have two different meanings. If we include the commas, what are we telling the reader? We're telling the reader that this phrase is not essential to understanding the main idea, that the reader could take this phrase out and still understand the main idea. Let's take it out. The bouncer threw the guy out of line. We're back to our base sentence. Okay, so that means that this is just a little something extra. We have a bouncer, he was checking IDs, and he threw a guy out of line. Okay, now let's look at the sentence without commas. This actually changes the meaning. By taking out the commas, we're telling our reader the opposite of what we told them before, which is that now this phrase, checking ID, is essential to understanding the meaning. The bouncer checking ID threw the guy out of line. Well, this could come up, for example, if you had more than one bouncer, and we don't know which bouncer threw the guy out of line. So maybe somebody asks you, hey, which bouncer threw the guy out of line? Well, it was the bouncer checking the ID who threw him out of line. And this comes up a lot of times when you need to clarify between multiple options or people or something that's going on in the sentence, and you're not sure without this essential information. Remember, not essential commas, essential no commas. Take a look at one more example. Another base sentence here. Linda's husband is a chemistry teacher. Let's add something. Linda's husband, Tom, is a chemistry teacher. You also will see the word appositive sometimes for these basically extra descriptive information that comes after a noun. And you could search for some pages. There's plenty of pages on that as well. Okay, so to use the commas or not to use the commas. Again, they're both correct, but they have very different meanings. So in this case, when we include the commas, again, not essential. That means we could take it out. And just means it's a little extra. So we have Linda and her husband Tom, who is a chemistry teacher. But now what happens if we take out the commas? Leaving them out again tells the reader that this is essential information, just like we saw with the example of the bouncer. And before, we saw that we were using that information. It was essential to distinguish which bouncer. Now the name is essential to which husband. That means that we're actually saying that Linda has one husband, Tom, and some other guy as a husband as well. Maybe even more. So she probably wouldn't be too happy to hear that. We want to add in our commas here. Make the world right again. And she's only got one husband again. Okay, that's probably... I know I'm moving past these topics pretty fast, but you can always pause and go back. So this comes up frequently. This issue here comes up frequently with family members. So you might say Linda's brother Tom. And in that case, if Linda just has one brother, we would use commas. Linda's brother, Tom, is a chemistry teacher, just like in this first example. But maybe if Linda had three brothers, then it would make sense we would want to take the commas out because it would specify which brother. So Linda's brother, Tom, is a chemistry teacher. That would mean she has a couple. Her other brothers maybe were, policemen or doctors, and you had to specify which brother was the chemistry teacher. Okay, again, so no commas would mean it's not. It would mean it is essential. I'm sorry. Okay, so if I totally scrambled your brain there, just remember we have some common elements here. Again, we have some wording that can't stand by itself. This time it's in the middle of the sentence, and it's not essential to understanding the main idea of the sentence. This guideline doesn't always work, but I like to throw it in. Basically, if you can say, hey, by the way, and put that before the extra information that you're adding in, then it's a clue that you're adding in something extra and not essential. So with all of those examples that we saw, you could say, hey, by the way, my husband's name is Tom. Well, we know that it's extra information, so you would have to use commas there. Not a perfect guideline, but it might help you out in some cases if you're trying to decide. Okay. If you want to look for more examples on this issue, there are many, many pages. You would want to just search around. Here's one. The Purdue OWL site has a lot of good resources. Some examples here. Came across another one just while I was searching on Write.com. First time I've seen this as well. Some nice examples, nicely written. Or you can just search the internet. Well, I wrote Google, but whatever you use for non-essential elements, commas, or sometimes they're called non-restrictive elements, commas. And you should find many, many pages with more examples in case my examples weren't clear enough. Okay. Let's move on to our final usage here. I just called it a common case because it's easier. You'll see in a moment that it's a little long description. So our final comma usage is that we use a comma between two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. That's kind of a mouthful and it's hard to remember. So let's break it down a little bit. An independent clause is just a sentence component that can stand on its own as a grammatically complete sentence. And a coordinating conjunction is just one of these 7 little words, and, but, or, so, yet, nor, or for. So we can rewrite our rule here as we use a comma between two sentence components that can stand on their own and are joined by and, but, or, so, yet, nor, or for. A little bit easier to remember. And a few of these words aren't even very common. Sometimes yet comes up, nor and for much less common. So you're mostly coming across these first 4 words. Makes it even a little bit easier. Let's look at a few examples. Nice and simple. I read a book and she listened to music. Well, we have to do our test. What were the 2 requirements for when to use a comma? First, we have to see if the 2 elements can stand on their own as grammatically complete sentences. The first one, I read a book. Yes, that certainly can. The second one, she listened to music. Yes, that can also stand on its own. And do we have one of those 7 little conjunctions? It looks like we do. So in this case, the comma is correct. Here's an example of one that doesn't meet all the criteria. We still have the first element, I read a book, that's fine. And we do have one of our 7 words, that's also fine. But this second element cannot stand on its own as a grammatically complete sentence, so we do not use a comma here. And this is a really, really common mistake, so you want to keep your eye out for this. Also, this kind of sentence structure is very, very common. You'll see this probably almost in every paragraph that you write. So keep an eye out. Basically, you need another subject in the second element. So, the first sentence we had, I read a book and she listened to music. Here we don't have another subject. You could also see a repetition of the same subject. And that would qualify as 2 elements that could stand by their own. If you're not sure, just make sentences out of them like we did here and check for one of the 7 words. Just a few more examples to illustrate the point. These are just some movie quotes. That kid's long gone, and this old man is all that's left. Here we have one that's a complete sentence, a second element that's a complete sentence, and one of our 7 little words, yep, so we need a comma. It will be a love story, for she will be my heroine for all time. Again, I use this one because it's a little less common, but just to show. We have 2 grammatically complete elements joined by one of the 7 little magic words, so we need a comma. Here's a longer one. You've never held your best friend's head in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath, looking to you for help. Okay, well this one, let's break this down a little bit. Our first element, you've never held your best friend's head in your lap. Is that grammatically complete? Could it stand on its own? Yes, it is. Yes, it could. We do have one of our 7 little words. But now here our second element, watched him gasp his last breath, blah, blah, blah. That actually it could not stand on its own, so it doesn't meet the criteria that we had before, and therefore there's no comma right here. Okay? That one's actually might have seemed confusing when we first put the rule up, but it's actually a pretty easy one, and it's pretty common, so you want to get it right. And let's just do a quick recap of the rules that we saw today. We saw 4 of them. List, that was quite easy, just always use all the commas in the list. And we looked at sentence introductions. That was a word, phrase, or clause at the beginning of a sentence that couldn't stand on its own and provided some context or described the rest of the sentence. We saw some different kinds, but again, those are situations where you're probably already doing it right most of the time, but I just wanted to show you why, show you some examples. We looked at probably the trickiest one today, which was the extra information in the middle of the sentence. You want to ask yourself, in this case, is the extra information essential to understanding the main idea? And if it's not, then you put commas around it. That might be one you want to review a little bit. And finally, we looked at this common case, which was having the 2 grammatically complete elements joined by one of the 7 little words. And you could jump back to see what the 7 coordinating conjunctions are if you can't remember. But those are that was a pretty easy one too. And I hope that this wasn't too intimidating. I know I moved pretty fast, so feel free to replay any of it as much as you like. And also, please feel free to ask me any questions that you have, and I'll get back to you. So good luck with your comma usage, and moving towards a cleaner, more precise, and accurate presentation of your ideas.